enduring value and relevance today, assessing contemporary feminist discourse on the epic. So let's begin with its value and relevance. Contemporary time is a witness to the enduring value and relevance of the great Indian epic Ramayana. The Ramayana pervades much of the cultural consciousness of Hindu society in particular and of Asian societies with Hindu influences in general. Over the millennia, its popularity has not waned. The epic is continuously being taught in all levels of education, making every child and adult, regardless of gender, conversant about the Ramayana. When it comes to popular culture and the arts, the Ramayana has been a favorite subject in films, visual arts, comic books, dance performances, theater performances, mass-produced cultural goods, as well as television series. Not only does Ramayana continue to influence the East, but also reached Western countries such as the United States. Just as many aspects of Hindu culture and philosophy reached the shores of the United States through popular culture, so did the Ramayana come into the consciousness of ordinary Americans through such means. A controversy even commenced upon the production of Nina Payne's version of the Ramayana in the animated film series Sita Sings the Blues. Many critics argue that such an animated film have denigrated and defiled the sacred tradition carried by the story of the Ramayana in a manner that is offensive and insulting to the Hindus. Sharmila Dadhiya juxtaposes this particular controversy to a wider problematic phenomena concerning Hindu culture and spirituality in the West. Issues on fragmentation, displacement, and commodity fetishism of Hindu deities in the market come to the fore, all of which, Ludhiya argues, hamper dialogue among cultures in this age of globalization, cultural exchange, and transnational identity. The Ramayana has also been used to justify decisions and actions both in the private and public spheres. For instance, Muktilakhi Mangharam narrates that during the wedding feast in India of her cousin, the latter's father advised the bride that she should not begin eating before her husband did. The reason for such advice is that it is the dharmic duty of a wife to be as devoted as possible to her husband in the same manner that Sita was a devoted spouse to Rama. Indeed, this goes to show how Sita's conjugal experiences and actions wields significant influence in the consciousness of most Hindu women. And this is not without textual support from the sacred scriptures of the Hindus. D.S. Sarma, for instance, ends his prose version of the epic entitled Srimad Ramayana with the following: Every man's ambition was to be like Rama, trustful, just, pious, generous, and brave, and every woman's ambition was to be like Sita, pure, faithful, tender, and resolute. Unfortunately, there are instances when the Ramayana is used to justify violence against women. Lodhia shares that in May 2012, the Ramayana was cited in a widely discussed family law decision of the Bombay High Court. It says, a wife should be like goddess Sita, who left everything and followed her husband Lord Ram to the forest and stayed there for 14 years. Sita's significance within a broader landscape of patriarchal values was reflected even more starkly in a statement by BJP Minister Kailash Vijaywargiya following the 2012 little gang rape of Jyoti Singh in New Delhi, drawing on what he perceived as her moral transgression in stepping out into the public sphere at night. He invoked a scene from the Ramayana to explain, if not overtly justify, the violence committed against her. He said, only when Sita Ji crossed the Lakshman Rekha, she was kidnapped by Ravan. And if Sita Ji, woman, crosses the Lakshman Rekha, then Sita Haran, crime against them, is bound to take place as Ravans are out there. Now, these uses of the Ramayana to perpetrate and perpetuate discrimination oppression, and violence against women brings us to another manifestation of the enduring value or relevance of the Ramayana, this time in the academic sphere. There is an ongoing feminist discourse on the epic, inspired by the present situation that women experience in relation to the use of the Ramayana to justify pathological patriarchal values. This discourse proceeds in two directions. First, there is the feminist critique of the epic. Feminists notice that the use of Sita as the ideal model for Hindu women is actually detrimental for these women in the achievement of their selfhood, individuality, and emancipation. The other direction of the discourse, on the other hand, provides a critique of such feminist critique. This direction shows how Sita actually embodies ideals that these feminists claim Sita does not have. So let us look at the latter direction of the discourse. Let us examine the critique of the feminist critique of the epic. G.R.K. Murthy in Sita in Valmiki Ramayana, a feminist archetype, argues that a dispassionate examination of Sita's conduct all through the epic does not give the reader an impression that she has ever sacrificed any of her values and rights as an individual. He adds that nor could a reader see Sita anywhere in the epic subjugating herself to male dominance. Murthy even identifies 7 attributes of Sita which shows that she never compromised her individuality, such as being the asserter, the voice of Dharma, the commander at ease, the optimistic debater, the lady of endurance, the lady of self-respect, and the defier of male chauvinism. On the other hand, Hetal Doshi, in feminist reading of Indian epics, exploring Sita and Draupadi through the current perception, goes in the same direction that is Murthy in showing how feminist biases are inherent in current readings of the Indian epics. The problem, according to Doshi, is that feminists have this tendency to read everything with an acute bias towards male and social setups, which spills over in their readings of literary mythological characters such as Sita and Draupadi of the Ramayana and Mahabharata respectively. Doshi laments that even Sita and Draupadi could not escape from the microscopic attention of feminist lenses. Feminists, for instance, view Sita as nothing but a mute victim of patriarchal society and domestic violence. Feminists treat Ravana's abduction of Sita and Rama asking Sita to prove her purity as a non-endurable slur to the dignity of a female. The same is true with the case of Rama deserting Sita when she was found pregnant. Feminists, Doshi notes, treat such a case as an insult to womanhood. Now the discourse deepens and goes beyond merely criticizing feminist analysis of the epic. Sally J. Sutherland Goldman, in Women at the Margins, Gender and Religious Anxieties in Valmiki's Ramayana, looks into the authorial intention of Valmiki himself and argues that Valmiki conceptualizes and creates specific types of female figures, such as Sita, Anasuya, Sabari, Svayamprabha, Surasa, and Nikumbila, and carefully locates the episodes in which they appear to mark specific character transitions in real or imagined anxiety-inducing threats to the author's idealized world. Instead of outrightly throwing away Hindu patriarchal culture, as what the feminist readings does, Goldman becomes generous and mature in handling the context from which the epic emerged. By considering how Valmiki construed such Vedic patriarchal context, and how Valmiki, through the use of women characters, propounded on his own idealized Vedic world, one which is more stronger, more stable, and less corruptible than his present Vedic society. Now, speaking of marginalized female characters in the Ramayana, it seems that there is yet another one who is often missed, whether it be Valmiki's Ramayana, Kamban's Iramavataram, Tulsidas Ramcharitmanas, or the popular Bengali version of Kritibas, as well as the well-known English version of R.K. Narayan. And this female character is no other than Urmila, Lakshmana's wife and Sita's sister. Ayesha Viswamohan in Urmila, Existential Dilemma and Feminist Concerns, is deeply troubled by the magnitude of neglect that has been doled out to this character. Oftentimes, Urmila is simply dismissed as Lakshmana's wife and Janaka's daughter without actually seeing that she also has a personal journey worth telling. Her personal journey began when Lakshmana had to accompany Rama in exile, thereby leaving Urmila behind. Viswamohan treats this moment of Urmila as the end of her age of innocence and sheltered existence. Viswamohan writes, in Heideggerian terms, she becomes being for itself or a conscious being. She is gratified by the awareness that although she is a prisoner of this muddy vesture of decay, her spirit transcends all bounds. In this epiphanic moment, she becomes conscious of the fact that she has an individuality and identity independent of her husband. One can easily notice, however, that Viswamohan's analysis of the character of Urmila works on an existential feminist framework. Her rural assessment and problematizing of her so-called Urmila's dilemma, which appears to be an existential one rather than a moral one, are working on assumptions of individuality, authenticity, and selfhood that are Western in orientation. The imposition of this orientation, in a sense, prevents us from seeing Urmila in the actual context of Hindu society and culture, which, if seen in such light, will actually dissolve Urmila's existential dilemma. Is there another way then to assess the whole problem of the status of women in the epic that does not have to invoke orientations and frameworks of foreign origin alone, but one which utilizes concepts from within, although recast in another way? Fortunately, Muktilakhi Mangharam in Rama, Must I Remind You of Your Divinity, locating a sexualized, feminist, and peer reading in the Ramayana, provides some insights. Mangharam is aware of contemporary retellings of the Ramayana, which are often desexualized to serve extremely conservative attitudes towards marriage, sex, and sexuality by nationalist and patriarchal discourses in India in order to limit women's ways of being in the world. In light of such, Mangharam argues that the Sanskrit Ramayana of Valmiki is actually a highly sexualized text that is open for feminist and queer interpretations. Mangharam elaborates, a sexualized lens enables feminist interpretations by highlighting women as key players in the enactment of their own sexualities, as sexual subjects rather than objects, by emphasizing justice for both men and women through an exploration of the treatment of Sita by her husband. It facilitates a queer reading because it enables the text to be read as sanctioning not just heterosexual conjugality, but a wide range of sexual experience. Such a queer reading highlights the text's deviations from fixed gender and sexual identities, deviations that become a political move against heteronormativity while refusing to engage in essentialist identity politics. Furthermore, such sexualized lens enables a view of sexual love, kama, in all its diversity, as a vital step towards achieving moksha or spiritual salvation, thereby reworking the idea of the kind of dharma that leads to moksha. In addition, Mangharam argues that instead of showing that various kinds of love, such as premarital, extramarital, and queer, are opposed to dharma, Valmiki uses them to nuance the notion of dharma itself. Such invites us to reconsider morality as something that may be encompassing flexible, sexualized, feminist, and queer identities. Indeed, Mangharam is challenging hegemonic and heteronormative readings of the Ramayana at this point. From the foregoing, we have shown that the ongoing interest of feminist scholars contributes to the Ramayana's contemporary relevance. There are some gaps, however, that can be of help in directing future directions of the discourse. First, One can notice that majority of the frameworks used to understand, analyze, and evaluate the various aspects of the epic, especially that of female characters, are Western in orientation, such as existential and feminist frameworks. Although we have gathered much about such insights from the use of foreign frameworks, there is a constant need to go back to the indigenous framework from which the Ramayana emerged and which it mirrored. Scholars must be cautioned that the use of foreign frameworks may actually distort the realities embedded in Hindu culture and philosophy. There's a more fruitful strategy that Mangharam showed us earlier that makes use of foreign frameworks to enrich indigenous concepts, that is, by sexing, feministing, and queering dharma, kama, and moksha. I think that using Western frameworks to enrich fundamental Hindu concepts, is a more fruitful and dialogical approach rather than simply imposing existential and feminist frameworks to evaluate the decisions and actions of characters in the epic, which in turn used to bolster certain biases and microscopic looks against Hindu culture, society, and philosophy that Doshi and Mangharam noticed. Second, Mangharam's work is indeed a pioneer in attempting to re-examine the basic Hindu concepts of karma, dharma, and moksha through the Ramayana. However, there is also a need to reconsider the claims that Mangharam is making regarding those Hindu concepts, especially that Mangharam even went to the point, although an interesting one, where dharma can be cleared. Thus, Mangharam opens a new whole direction for scholars interested in discourses on dharma. And this is, I think, where discourses on the Ramayana, be it feminist or otherwise, should go back to, considering that the Ramayana is an epic on dharma. Most of the feminist discourses seem to have overlooked dharma in their analysis. Going back to dharma will also remind scholars of what is essential to Hindu philosophy and Eastern philosophy in general, which is right living and harmonious existence. Feminist discourses are reminded that the goal of Hindu men and women is not so much about asserting one's right to property and liberty, as well as gender equality and emancipation. It is about the achievement of knowledge towards right action. There is a danger that if we forget dharma in feminist discourses, the discourse might end up being caught in Western concepts and ideals, while taking for granted the true goal of Hindu life as elucidated in the Ramayana. Our short exploration and assessment of the ongoing feminist and gender studies discourses on the epic shows that the Ramayana can still serve as a starting point and avenue for dialogue between feminists and non-feminists, men and women, classical arts and popular culture, and most especially between Western and Eastern orientations in this age of globalization. And for our case in Southeast Asia, where integration is a buzzword, may we see in how we appropriated the Ramayana in our sense of Southeast Asianness, and may it open more opportunities for us to understand and appreciate one another. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, sir, for